This is Jen Taylor Skinner. I want to tell you about a great new podcast, The Election Ride Home. Someone's going to challenge Donald Trump for the White House. The Election Ride Home is a podcast dedicated to figuring out who that someone, or maybe even multiple someones, will end up being. Every day at 5 p.m. Eastern, veteran journalist and This American Life contributor Chris Higgins catches you up on what happened on the campaign trail. Who's up? Who's down? What issues are getting traction? What do the polls say? It's a 15 to 20 minute show that keeps track of all the latest and summarizes it so you don't have to nervously refresh your web browser 12 times a day. It's like TLDR as a service. So if you want to catch up on what you've missed on your way home, search your podcast app and subscribe to the Election Ride Home podcast. I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is The Electorette. On this episode, I talk with Dr. Fiona Vera Gray about street harassment and her book, The Right Amount of Panic: How Women Trade Freedom for Safety. I opened my conversation with Dr. Gray with a story from her book of a woman describing her first experience with street harassment when she was only 7 years old. The woman describes her confusion about the incident and her family's reaction when she told them about her experience.
So that was a woman called Claire from memory, so all of the women gave pseudonyms, so some of them are real names, some of them are not real names. But she told this really interesting story about, she grew up on an estate and her school was quite close to her estate, and so it was quite safe for her to walk, or her parents felt it was quite safe for her to walk to and from school. And she was either coming back or going to a fancy dress party that they had at the school, and she had forgotten to tell her parents that it was fancy dress, as kids do, and so at the last minute they had to kind of struggle around the house and try and find something, and I'm not sure actually what she went as in the end, but they managed to put like a black bin bag on her bottom half so it looked like she had a skirt on. And she was saying that when she was either going to or coming back from this event at school at 7 years old, she had some men whistle at her or like call out like, "Well, hey," as she was walking. And one of the things that really struck me about her story, it's very similar to some of the other ones that women told me of when they were around that time, is that because she was 7 years old, she actually didn't understand what that meant. She didn't understand why the men were doing that. She didn't understand what sexual harassment was, or that because she was female, she was going to be a target of it at some point in her life. And so she kind of came home and told the people there that, this had happened, and she wasn't quite sure what it was or what it meant. And, that their response was, "Oh, that's a bad thing." They weren't saying this is good, this shouldn't have happened. But then they all of a sudden went, "Oh, it's because of what you're wearing. It's because, what you're wearing must look like it's a mini skirt or it's a leather skirt or it's a short skirt. So the problem is both the men's behavior, but a little bit what you're wearing." And it just really stands out that, this is a 7-year-old girl who was wearing a bin bag liner, literally, and that still gets seen as being a justification for men to interrupt, intrude, and harass her when she's in public.
Right. That's amazing to me that this happened when she was 7, and also that so early that people would put the blame on her behavior when, first of all, she didn't really even make the decision herself. Her parents helped her make the decision, right?
Totally.
And I have a 7-year-old. And the innocence, they're really, really innocent. 7-year-olds aren't thinking about sexual harassment or thinking about that at all, really.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really shown in her response that she didn't know, she didn't know what this was. And what's interesting is that over time, what I saw was that women start to change that response, where at 7, because she's so innocent and so naive, she goes home and immediately tells somebody. Over time, women learn to not go home and immediately tell somebody, because the response you're going to get is going to be a little bit dismissive like that. It might blame you. It might call you narcissistic or paranoid. And so it really shows, this little 7-year-old having no idea what the response was going to be, and how that first response is so important, because it actually impacts how she learns to make sense of this as she goes through her life.
Yeah, it's funny, thinking back on my own experiences, and I think one of the earliest memories I have is one where there was, a creepy guy driving around the neighborhood asking young girls for hugs. We were warned to stay away from this blue car. But the second memory I have was similar to hers, was about my clothing. Like, so much of this is intertwined with a woman's appearance or a girl's appearance, being warned, make sure your skirt isn't too short, or make sure, all of the baggage and the responsibility that's put on women.
Yeah, absolutely. And that there's no way of getting that right. I've spoken to women who have been blamed when they've been wearing a coat, like a full length, long, big wool coat, because it was red, and red attracts attention. And so you should know not to wear a red coat. And I've spoken to women that have been harassed when they've been wearing a short skirt, and so you've got on both sides, like you either completely cover yourself up or you don't cover yourself up. It doesn't really matter, because either way, something that you're doing is going to be seen as being the cause of this kind of behavior, rather than the cause actually being located in the way that society has situated men and has situated women, and has told men repeatedly through lots of different avenues that it is okay to interrupt a woman, to comment on her appearance, to judge a woman on her appearance, and to value a woman based on what she looks like.
Right. And, even our schools perpetuate that. I was thinking, all of the school dress codes, which are kind of focused on the girls, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. We had over here, this was a couple of years ago in Yorkshire, there was, they were trying to make, I think it was girls' skirts had to be below the knee, or there was some kind of comment about girls' skirts because the male teachers were finding it distracting. And the fact that as a society we can in any way say that that is an appropriate response for male teachers to be talking about finding 15, 16-year-old girls distracting because of what they're wearing, I mean, that just shocks me. Our kids are in school so they can learn and be educated by adults, not so that adults can view them in any kind of way that would cross over into sexual harassment or a sexual type of gaze. But it shows how embedded this idea of women's clothing, women's actions as being responsible for men's violence is.
Can you help establish the scope of this? How do you define sexual harassment or public harassment or street harassment specifically? Because, some behaviors, I think that, people say, oh, that just falls into the realm of friendliness. And, for a lot of people, the boundaries aren't clear.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, there's lots of problems with definitions around this area, and it's one of the reasons why it's been so overlooked for so long. I think that now, since everything that's happened with Me Too, there's been a much bigger focus on it. We've just had Parliament over here has just finished an inquiry on public sexual harassment, which has been amazing. That would have been unimaginable when I started looking at this in like 2010, 2011. But one of the reasons why it's been so missed is because there are those differences of definitions. Even there, it's difficult for you to know. We don't even really know what this is called. Is it public sexual harassment? Is it street harassment? Is it male intrusion? Like, we find it really hard. We don't have a word for it yet. That means that research, when it tries to address this, a lot of the times are addressing different things. So some studies will include things like wolf whistling, being commented on in a sexual way that made you feel uncomfortable, or being touched in public. Others will also include things like being followed, or feeling as though you're being followed, or being stared at, or feeling as though you're being stared at in public, right the way up to other studies. I mean, when I was kind of looking at it and trying to define it, I included things like rape that took place in public spaces where the perpetrator was a stranger, because when women were talking about these experiences, it was very difficult for them to say exactly when something started and when something stopped. So there was one woman, for example, who Beck, who talks about an attempted rape that took place in public space after a male stranger on a tube stop had walked past her, kind of stared at her in a way that made her feel uncomfortable, and said hello. And I'm sure many of us have had that experience. And she, said hello back, because we're taught to be polite and that you should engage and, all of this stuff. And so she said hello back. And then he walked down the platform and stared at her. And then when she got off at the other end, she heard steps behind her, and she turned around, she saw it was him. And at that moment, she knew that something was really wrong, because he would have had to follow her over a number of different stops, tube lines, and then he actually followed her and attempted to rape her, and she was able to get into her gate before he was, which was fantastic. But that for me is that's a form of public sexual harassment. It's also a form of public sexual violence. It's also a form of attempted rape. So it's the categories kind of blur into each other and overlap. So it's very difficult to pin down this phenomenon. But the thing that makes it quite clear is that when you talk to women know this. Women and girls know this. They've all had experiences. Once you start to explain it, there has been no one that I've spoken to that hasn't been able to say, as you just have, yes, I can remember this experience from childhood, and actually I remember these couple of weird things that happened, in my adult life. The things that we forget are the things that happened maybe earlier this morning or yesterday or last week, because we learn to forget them and to dismiss them and to downplay them. But it's such a common experience, and For men, I think we do have, again, after Me Too, there's been a lot of discussion from men saying, at least in the UK, does this mean, is this the end of flirting? Does this mean that heterosexual men are not going to be able to talk to a woman that they find attractive? And I think that those things, it belittles how complex we are as human beings and how much we can read other people's verbal and physical and social cues, that it's actually not very hard to tell when you are making someone feel uncomfortable. It's not very hard to tell when somebody is maybe engaging with you but doesn't want to. She keeps looking down at her book. She keeps turning to her mobile phone. She's moving away from you, but you're still sitting with her on the bus and trying to engage her in conversation. And so I do think that sometimes it's a way of deflecting responsibility again back onto women. So something like, how are we to know? You guys make it so confusing for us men to know where the line is. How are we supposed to be able to behave appropriately? But the fact that, to be honest, the majority of men do behave appropriately and don't sexually harass women in public. And that to me says it's actually not that hard, and this kind of behavior is purposeful and it has an intent behind it.
Right. That's a really excellent point. I was just thinking about that. The idea that, they're putting the work back on to women, right? The work onto women to give them a definitive list of things that they can and cannot do, when more than likely most men do understand what the boundaries are.
Yeah. The research that's been done shows that, we, as human beings, we are incredibly built for empathy and built to be able to understand emotionally what is happening for other human beings. It's been part of our evolutionary benefit, to live as a community, to be able to know what's happening for other community members. We know this, again, you've got a child, the way that children can really read their mother's expression and their father's expression, and the way that parents learn to become quite adept at responding to their baby's needs, even when they're in a pre-verbal stage, that continues through adult life. And so research that's been done on something called sexual miscommunication, for example, which is the idea that sexual assault and sexual violence, rape, happens because of a misunderstanding, because someone didn't communicate no strong enough, or one party, the male party, generally thought that this was something that the other party wanted but the other party didn't, but there was miscommunication. And the research evidence for that shows that it's really, really weak, that actually people are very, very good at understanding cues, whether they be verbal or whether they be nonverbal, to understand how other people are responding to them and what other people want. Whether or not someone decides to respect those cues is a whole different thing.
Right. I just thought of a really terrible analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's just that, boundaries in every other respect are understood, right? If someone, is sitting next to you on a bus stop and they put their wallet down that's filled with money, you aren't going to accidentally think that they're giving you the money, right?
Yeah. Exactly. That's a really good example.
Yeah.
We know these things. If you invite someone out for dinner, and that, like a friend, if you say, "Oh, do you want to do this?" or your partner, and they say, maybe, that means they don't really want to do it. Kind of. We know that means no. It's just whether or not we decide to go, we're going to take that kind of, and we're going to try and push it and see if we can get it to a yes. That's where the difference comes. But the actual understanding of what somebody else means it's pretty intuitive for us.
So can you define what safety work means?
The main thing really that came out of the study that I did with women in the UK on sexual harassment in public that I was super surprised by, which was brilliant, because doing research, you always want to find something that you weren't expecting. That's what makes it fun. That's what makes my job fun. So how I did it was I interviewed women at the beginning, and then I asked them to keep a notebook for between, I think it was 2 weeks to 2 months, of things that happened in public spaces. So to record, the little things that we forget, the staring, the little comments, feeling like you're being followed. And then we had a second follow-up interview to talk through what they'd found. And so when I started this, I was expecting, that women would come back to me with notebooks full of all these things that had happened, and we would be able to discuss them, and, it would be great. And what happened for the majority of women was that there actually wasn't at all as much as they had expected there to be. In the first interviews, they were saying that it'd be rare if this didn't happen every week. This is something that becomes just part of going outside. And what they found when they were looking for it was that actually wasn't the case, that it wasn't happening as much as they were feeling like it was happening, because they were preparing themselves in advance for it to happen. And so they were doing a whole bunch of things that they hadn't even really entirely made conscious in order to try and prevent or try and avoid or try and reduce the likelihood of them being intruded on. So really simple things like making sure that you've always got your mobile phone on, taking headphones out with you, wearing sunglasses, to choosing particular spaces and places on public transport. So when I started asking women about these things, from a number of interviews, it kept coming up. And so when I did start asking women, do you get onto a train and choose a particular seat? A number of women were able to say, yeah, I always sit next to a woman, or I always sit in a seat that doesn't have two seats either side of it, or I will stand up, close to the exit, or if I'm getting off a bus and there's someone on there that's made me feel uncomfortable, or there's any kind of man on there really and I'm not feeling that comfortable, I'll make sure that he gets off first, or I'll hang back a bit until the last minute before I get off so that he doesn't know exactly what my stop is. I'll take particular routes home. I'll wear particular things. So women talking about taking out baseball caps with them, which this really stuck in my mind. Baseball caps. So one woman in particular talking about, she had long blonde hair, and she would talk about taking out a baseball cap late at night so she'd be able to put her hair into a baseball cap so she felt like she wasn't that identifiable on the street. Women talking about taking flat shoes, not only for comfort but also so if they needed to they could run. All of these things, just daily, habitual, little things that when you take it together, you start to see that there is a lot of work that women are putting into trying to feel safe in public space. And that work isn't recognised. It's not recognised by us. We don't think about it. It just becomes what we do. And it's very rarely recognised publicly. We have over here, and often we have police safety campaigns that happen around Christmas when it's like the party season and there's lots of work parties, and they'll always say things like, make sure if you're leaving, always directed at women, if you're leaving, make sure you leave with a friend, or don't let your friends leave alone, or don't get too drunk, or just basically be careful, be very, very careful, women. And what those messages do is they don't in any way acknowledge the amount of work that women are already doing. They don't say anything that says, hey, women, we know you're having to do a whole lot of extra work that the majority of men are not having to do just to feel safe, and that sucks. And as the police, we're going to try and do better to help you feel safer. Instead, it does that thing again where it responsibilizes women at the same time as making them feel like all of this work that they're doing is pointless, because they still need to be told what to do to feel safe, because actually, women are a little bit clueless. So it all kind of comes together, and it sits alongside all of the other forms of work that women generally have to do that are forms of unpaid labour. So things like the emotional labour, often in jobs, but also often in relationships, not just intimate relationships, but friendships with men, women having to take the bulk of the emotional labour, household labour. I mean, we're still 2018 and still there's a great discrepancy in the amount of household labour that women do, particularly invisible forms of work like the administration of the house, really basic, boring admin jobs, whereas men are maybe helping out more with, cleaning and things like that. Women are still organising the school runs and all of that kind of stuff. And this is just an extra form of work that women are being asked to perform without any form of recognition.
Right. To something you said about the lack of clear lines for women, and that speaks to the fear that you're talking about. And what I mean by that is that I think what a lot of people don't understand is that street harassment for women or public harassment, there isn't necessarily a clear line as to when that may turn violent or when that may turn into a rape. So, that's where the fear comes from, because it could be someone who's just, catcalling you, or it could be someone who's going to follow you home and they may assault you, right? We have no clear way of knowing when it's going to turn. Right. And so I also want to talk about this gap. There's a gap in the amount of work and the amount of fear that women feel, based on when you ask them to record the diary and what actually happens to them. Right.
Well, yeah, both of those things are connected. So there's something in criminology, you may have heard it, called the fear of crime paradox. And it's always kind of brought out. I was at a conference actually last week in Sweden, and everyone was talking about it. It was about crime and fear in public spaces. And this fear of crime paradox is really consistent across research, across decades, that shows that women are more scared of crime in public spaces, but men are actually more likely to be victims. And a lot of research has been put in to try and explain why, and it's always focused on women's fear as being irrational, not on men as irrationally understanding actually how much at risk they are in public. And one of the big kind of explanations is this idea of a shadow of sexual assault thesis, which is the idea that women's fear in public spaces is underpinned by this particularly gendered fear around sexual assault, that women are targeted in reality for sexual violence in ways that men are not, but also that women exist in a world where violence against women and sexual violence is continuously pumped out in all different media venues. It's the subject of so many movies and TV shows and films, and women read media reports of other forms of sexual violence that women have experienced. So it becomes in our lives a very lived possibility, combined with the fact that because it's a reality for so many women and girls, more than we will ever know, this is something that has happened. It's happened in our past, it's happened as children, it's happened in our teenage years, it's happened with our husbands as adults. And so those two things combined, both our experience that this is actually something that really does happen to women and really does happen to us, combined with these constant messages that this is something that happens to women, means that we have a really particular fear that is around sexual assault. That means, exactly as you said, that someone may be wolf whistling at us can evoke that feeling of, and it doesn't happen all the time, of course, but it can evoke a feeling of, if someone is looking at me in a sexual way, in a way that I don't have control of, what else might they be able to do sexually that I don't have control of? So there's that kind of side of it. But then the other thing that I'm started to think about around the fear of crime paradox is maybe what it's showing us, maybe that gap between women's fear and what they experience, maybe that's showing us actually that women's safety work is quite successful, because we can't really know how successful it is. If you decide, I've got to go to the shops later on and it's going to be dark because it's winter here. And so, if I decide to go out and to stick by the main road the whole way rather than go down a back alley that I can go down, which I probably will decide to go down by the big road, I'm not able to measure whether or not I just avoided some form of sexual harassment, because it's the absence of something that could have happened, but it also could have not happened. So my behavior changed me being able to know whether or not that was ever going to happen to begin with. So I can't measure how successful it is. But I wonder if some of what that gap is showing us is that actually women's work is quite successful, that we have this fear, and because of this fear, we act in particular ways in public space, and that is reducing the amount of crime in public that we experience. It's going to be very difficult for us to know if that's the case, but the fact that it's never even been offered as an option, it's never been looked at in that way, that women's resistance is actually successful, that we're actually quite capable, and we've been doing really well, and we can't get it right all of the time. We're not going to get it right all of the time. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes for whatever reason, we're going to choose to feel freer rather than feel more constrained but more safe. So we're going to choose to go down the back alley because actually it's really quiet and the road is really busy and it's quite nice there because there's some trees. And so sometimes we're going to choose differently, and sometimes things are going to happen because we're not actually responsible or able to control how other people interact with us. And those are the only times that we can count. So all we ever focus on is women's failure in terms of keeping themselves safe, and we never look at actually how successful most of us are a lot of the time at stopping forms of sexual harassment, sexual violence and crime in public.
Yeah, when I read about that in your book, I was a bit confused about how to feel about that because, I mean, it is good that, possibly that the safety work is working, right? But it also kind of sends a message that we should continue the safety work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't think it necessarily follows. So we can say on one hand, we're doing a job, we're actually quite capable at doing this, and also on the other hand, at the same time critique, why are we having to do this is ridiculous. We need to come together as a society and make sure that all people feel safe enough to move through public space freely, that public space is there for everybody, and we shouldn't be having women and girls routinely restricting their enjoyment and their access of it because they don't feel safe. So I think for me, you can hold both of those two things together. I definitely wouldn't want to be suggesting that, basically women are doing all this work, so everything's fine. Let's let them crack on. That's great, because it's not. What the point, I guess, of recognizing the work and showing it as being successful is on one hand to talk back to those the way that women are made responsible for preventing sexual violence and the way women are blamed the times when they're not successful, to be able to say, hey, actually, can everyone just realize how much women are having to restrict themselves daily because of sexual violence? And can we then stop blaming women when they experience sexual violence because actually they've had to live a lot of their life restricted because of the fear of this thing, and then this thing has happened to them anyway? So can we just, on one hand, give women a break around that? And I'm saying that to women and to men. Again, there's been a number of studies that have shown that women can sometimes be more harsh, can be more victim blaming of other women around things like sexual assault and rape. And I think that comes down to again the fact that this safety work isn't talked about even amongst women. We don't talk to each other about what we're doing, and we blame other women if we perceive that they're not doing all of the things that we feel are automatic, that we feel are common sense. And so for me, there's something really important about making it visible and making it speakable. And that by doing that, hopefully we start to see the injustice in the fact that we've got half of the population, including, as we said at the beginning, girls from 7, 8, 9 years old, having to perform this form of invisible labour that men are not, and that women are never able to experience as being something that's actually quite a unique and developed skill set that they've built from experience over time.
That's really interesting that women are critical of other women for not doing the safety work properly, right? It's almost like, a lesson to be learned, like in school, we learned our multiplication tables. And if you study hard enough, you'll pass and you'll get an A. That's another bad analogy. Like women, women are taught these safety lessons, and then we judge other women if they don't learn the lessons well enough.
Yeah. That's an excellent way to put it. And again, we need to not blame women for doing that. Like, this is the thing. It's not about then blaming women for being too blamey of other women. Like, that just puts us in a circle. It's about understanding how women are situated in a social context that encourages women to feel that this behavior is part of what it means to be a woman. We are encouraged to not see this as something external that someone does. We're encouraged to think about it as being common sense. It is just common sense as a woman in the world that you do not walk home by yourself in the dark. That's just common sense. And as long as we keep it as common sense and we don't actually interrogate why is that the case? That's not normal. That's not inevitable. That's not biological. That is socially produced. And as long as we don't interrogate that, of course we're going to blame women that we perceive as kind of transgressing these norms that have been established for women's behavior in order to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah. What else I think is what was really interesting in research that you cited was that women fear rape more than murder because rape is often depicted as unsurvivable, which is not logical, but it's true.
Yeah. It's quite, when you start to get into some of the research that's been done around that, it's quite astounding when you see how much, again, women's resistance and women's resilience has been under acknowledged. We don't talk about the resilience of survivors. We don't talk about, there are hundreds of thousands of women and girls in the world that have survived and been through one of the most destabilizing experiences that you can have, and it's not saying that because you've been through it, everything's fine and you come out the other end and it's a nice linear process. But we don't focus on those stories of resilience and resistance. We focus a lot on the damage. And again, going back to media representations, I mean, media isn't everything, but we do take a lot of information from it. And when I was researching for the book, I found a number of things that were talking about how disproportionately in entertainment shows, sexual violence is seen to result in death. And so it's completely disproportionate that women are seen to have been raped and killed. And when you see media reports, where this has happened, raped and killed. But we very rarely focus on, the fact that women are raped and go on to work in rape crisis centres and to do incredible forms of activism and to become academics and work in this area and to do awareness raising. All of these things become invisible, and we only ever focus on sexual violence, as you said, as unsurvivable.
So how does a woman's experience in her private spaces, private lives, how does that shape the fear that she has in public spaces? I'm thinking of, maybe you have an aggressive father or an overbearing father, or, maybe there's been domestic violence in the home, and that carries out into how you carry yourself in public spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it would be different for different women how they choose to kind of embody or respond to those experiences. But thinking about a couple of women, one woman that stands out that I interviewed, she was at the time in a relationship with a violent man. And she said that when she was then sexually harassed in public, what she experienced was it kind of compounded this feeling of her being worthless and that her value was just in her position as being something for men to interact with. So it was like she didn't feel safe in a private space, but she also wasn't safe in a public space with strangers. And it's those kind of things that I think as a society we should all, I would feel that we do all feel that that's wrong, that the fact that some women are experiencing unsafety in their private spaces, in their home, they're coming home at night and that is an unsafe space for them. That means that we need to be making sure that work is safe for women, that school is safe for women, and that public space is safe for women, to give these women places where they can start to expand that sense of self and feel a little bit freer, and that might support them to be able to live with what's happening in that private space. Another woman as well that I spoke to who had an ex-husband who was very physically violent, he almost killed her and she was in hospital. But she's told me that one of the things that really got him going, basically, was if he perceived that another man in public space was looking at her in a particular way, and that he would sometimes, if they went to bars and a man talked to her or looked at her, again, things she's not in control of, he felt she was so responsible for that behaviour that he would take her kind of around the corner and either beat her up or verbally abuse her. And so there's connections here between men seeing women as being private property, and that if they're being interacted in public space by another man, that's some kind of theft of their property. And there's connections for women in terms of how it makes you feel that these things that have happened in childhood or might be happening in private spaces with men that you know, with men that you love, can leave you with feelings about yourself that are then confirmed when a complete stranger thinks that they're entitled to tell you, whatever they want to tell you about yourself. And that's an important point as well, is that, again, a lot of the time we think about sexual harassment just in terms of quote unquote complimentary comments. So things like, hey, beautiful, hey, sexy, nice legs, those kind of things. But I was really surprised. I can't remember the statistics. I think it was around a third of women that I spoke with had been insulted in public about their appearance by a random stranger. So told that they're too fat, that they should go to Weight Watchers, told they have crab legs, a range of things, some with some very bad words actually, but a range of things that, again, the feeling there, one of the women was saying to me, and she was young as well, which kind of broke my heart. She's about 21, 22, and she was saying, I went home and I felt so bad. She was told she was called fat or ugly or something in public, and she went home and felt so bad because she was like, I must be so ugly if a stranger feels they have to tell me that. this isn't even someone who knows me. This is someone who just passing me by was compelled to tell me I really, truly must be really fat. I really must be really ugly. And so you start to see how those things blur between public spaces, things that she may have been told in private spaces, and things that she feels about herself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's one thing that we don't talk often enough in relation to this topic is the confusion that many women and girls feel around these intrusions and whether they should be flattered, right? And you hear women kind of going on about, I'm a mom now and I'm older and I don't get harassed as much as I used to.
Yeah,
and that is really confusing.
Exactly. And that tells us something, right? I mean, that tells us something really important about how we've been told to value the opinions of strange men about our appearance. Because when you think about it in a really logical way, actually, you don't care. You don't care what that random person that you just happened to cross on the street thinks about what you look like. I mean, that's not something that logically, most women care that much about. But when they don't interact with you in a way that you've been told is the way that they should interact with you, that can be experienced as a loss. So I absolutely spoke to women that said exactly that. As they were older, they said that they started to feel invisible, and that there was a bit of a loss in not being able to walk past a building site and not feeling as though someone was going to wolf whistle at them. But then they talked about, other forms of sexual harassment. So again, we see that it's a continuum, and there's different forms and different behaviors. So older women talking about that idea of being invisible. So there was one woman that I spoke to that was, I can't remember, she was in her 60s, late 60s, and she was talking about how men actually physically don't see her, or she feels as though men actually physically don't see her. And that for her is felt as an intrusion in public space. So men will bump into her, they'll push past her, they will walk in front of line and in front of the line with her, and she feels as though she's becoming actually physically invisible. And also for women, again, thinking about the insults and thinking about the breadth of this kind of behavior, women from Black and minority ethnic background being subjected to a really particular form of sexual harassment that's racialized. And so it not just being about what you look like in terms of that complementary feeling, but that being backed up and underpinned sometimes by some really racist stereotypes and tropes. So the idea that Black women should always be up for it, or that they should have to engage, or the idea that Asian women are supposed to be submissive and supposed to be passive. We have in the UK a rise of women who are visibly Muslim in public spaces, so wearing the hijab or burqa, being directed for a really particular type of public sexual harassment. And it is sexual because they're being directed, the harassment's being directed at them because they're women, they're identifiably Muslim in public. And so it's that intersection of being both religiously motivated and motivated by sexism, or both motivated by racism and motivated by sexism. And so for those women over time, if that sort of behavior starts to drop off, I can't imagine that it's experienced as a loss. I mean, that's a really particular form of telling women that you're not welcome in public.
I think it would be really interesting if we could somehow quantify the amount of freedom that women lose in relation to the safety work that we do. If we could quantify it in relation to the amount of freedom that men have, in the way that we can quantify pay equity. But I don't think we can do that.
That would be fantastic. I don't know how you would do that, but exactly. I mean, yeah, it's massive. That's the thing. The thing that I really found was that it becomes so normalized and it becomes so habitual that women aren't even thinking of this in terms of reducing our freedom, where it's this idea of safety being in tension with freedom, and to increase your safety you automatically reduce your freedom. But then that's kind of being configured as being just part of the way that the world is. It's just part of the way that the world is that you don't dress like that, or you don't go that particular route home, or you walk through the streets. Another thing that women were talking about was this idea of like hardening the target, so walking through the streets with a stern, not too stern, you don't want to be told to cheer up or smile, but stern enough so people know not to interact with you, kind of face on, and women saying, I don't want to walk through the streets looking like that. Sometimes I'm actually really happy, but I don't want to smile because I think that invites behavior. And these are tiny little chips away at our ability to be free and our ability to be. I think that's the thing that really came out for me. It's just the ability to be. When you think about public space, for loads of women, because of all of the work that we have to do in our private spaces, or because of experiences of violence in our homes, public space is this unique moment between, we're moving, it's transitory. We're not at work yet, or we're not at school yet, or we're not at the shops yet. We're not doing anything yet. And at the same time, we're not at home. So we've got kind of time to ourselves. That's what that space should be for. That commuting time should be for. That walking in public should be for that time to just be. And the fact that that's what gets taken away, that you can't just be, that you are having to think and consider escalation and try and evaluate the intentions of people who you don't know, that really disrupts your ability to just be in public space. And that's really sad, because that's one of the only times that we have, as women, as humans as well, but particularly as women, where there isn't that many obligations on us. There's not that much other stuff that we have to do. If our train is late, we can't do anything about it. And we should be able to enjoy the freedom that space gives us, but we're unable to, because we're having to constantly think about our safety.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please make sure you're subscribed to the Electorette. Just click on the subscribe button in iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast. Thanks so much again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.